Sometimes we have to understand how we got here. And as an evidential medium that is linked to the tradition of oracles, I want to remind you of ancient Athens. Because Athens actually experimented with democracy. And they also had powerful aristocratic families. And those powerful aristocratic families didn't really want a democracy, so they shifted it into an oligarchy. It was 404 BCE, and those wealthy aristocratic families that had all this power created the 30 tyrants. And what they did is they hired Sparta to back them up. So the 30 tyrants was an oligarchy council, and they ruled brutally. They would unalive their opponents. They would seize property, which, by the way, is very interesting to me that NVIDIA has to give 15% to the government in order to keep doing its business. We'll talk about that another time. But the 30 tyrants, they actually worked at silencing any criticism, any opposition. And what was the result of that? Bloodshed, lots of civil strife, and basically a war. But this wasn't the only civilization that went through this lesson. There was the Roman Republic. And although Rome was a republic, they had wealthy families that controlled the power. They were known as senatorial families, and they established control. They controlled the land, they controlled military operations. They also had a lot of influence and control over the court system. They blocked any kind of reform that redistributed wealth to the poor. And the result was deep inequality, which also led to civil war. So economic inequality, oligarchy, gridlock, equals the collapse of democratic institutions which Julius Caesar seized upon and led to him becoming an imperialistic ruler. But let's divert to Venice. And this is like the 13th to the 18th century. Venice was also hailed as a republic, but in reality it was a small group of really wealthy merchant families. They were known as the Great Council, and they monopolized trade and political power. And the wealthy council ruled for actually several years until it stagnated because they excluded new wealth and new ideas. Venice ended up losing its power, and it lost its edge into decline. So the lesson is oligarchies can bring stability, but it breeds rigidity and eventually brings about decline. And why don't we step into the United States? Because in the late 19th century, there was Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and these robber barons dominated resources. They dominated railroads, oil, steel, and banking. And they influenced politics through corruption, monopolies, and the control of the media. And it took reform movements to equalize power. And that occurred through labor unions, progressive taxes, and the disruption of trusts. And there are certain individuals today who feel that wealth concentration and corporate lobbying are prime for setting up oligarchies once again. Because when wealth inequality runs unchecked, the only option is for grassroots movements, and hopefully nothing worse like civil wars. So I have a warning that the rise of wealth consolidation, the domination of wealthy families and mega corporations, private equity groups that dominate and they control laws and politics can lead to decay, lots of public social resentment, and brooding anger, which leads us to one of two paths: collapse or authoritarian rule. But history is always whispering. Oligarchy always ends badly. Suffocating democracy erodes trust, and once that anger storm keeps brewing and heating up, it leads to what could be potentially massive civil unrest. So this is just my modern moral warning to the collective. that a crisis stage feels to me as though it's looming.